Hello, everyone. This is Michelle Rosecrans from the Miami University Alumni Association. Today, we are proud to present the webinar News from 1970 Student Cultures, the Vietnam War, and Birth of the Public Ivy. Your instructor today is Dr. Kurt Ellison, Miami University Professor Emeritus of History and American Studies and editor of the book Miami University 1809 to 2009 Bicentennial Perspectives. We are so thankful to Dr. Ellison for sharing his knowledge with us today. Questions were collected during registration, and Dr. Ellison will address some of those throughout the webinar today. You will also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button. We can't promise to get to every question, so Dr. Ellison has graciously offered for us to display his email address on screen. So if you wish to submit other comments or questions to him after the presentation, please do so in that manner. Today's webinar will last about an hour, and it will be posted on this website later on today or tomorrow. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ellison to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, I want to say welcome to all the former students, colleagues, members of the Institute for Learning and Retirement, the passionate alumni and friends who have joined the webinar today. I can tell you it's humbling for an historian to deal with traumatic past events when they're speaking to people who lived through them, because they leave strong memories and strong feelings of unresolved disputes, fixed opinions. That's still with us. For a historian, it's sort of like parts of a puzzle, or maybe a better image would be the blurred boundaries of an impressionist paint by numbers. You're trying to see the picture. One thing's for certain. This month is the 50th anniversary of an event that was important to Miami University. So now let's look at some evidence of that. So our topic is News from 1970, Student Cultures, the Vietnam War, and the Birth of the Public Ivy. We researched this topic for the Miami History book that you can see pictured here in the lower left corner of your screen, published in 2009, and the story is told in more detail there than we will be able to cover today. We will, however, see many images that may remind you or inform you about what happened in that day. We're going to start with a sort of interpretation. Helen Horowitz, a scholar of campus life, has said that during the late 60s and early 70s, there was a period of time when student cultures took on, as she calls it, a revolutionary character. This happened earlier in Miami history, but certainly the late 60s, early 70s was no exception. Usually when that happens, different subcultures of student life come together around a common theme. That happened. We also think of this as a clash of generations. One of the things that happened was changes in clothing styles and imagery. And you can see here in the picture to the left and the picture to the right, two students from 1970 who later became members of the university faculty and staff. In the upper right-hand corner, Associated Women students also became later members of the Miami staff. In the bottom, Dr. Shriver represents the World War II generation. You can see him here with his family, and certainly they had different views of authority and discipline and how things ought to go. Of course, the Vietnam War was an underlying theme throughout this era. As early as fall of 1968, the Student Senate organized a symposium for the campus, and they brought to campus people from all over the country, indeed from all over the world, very prominent people with very different opinions about what was going on in the war in Vietnam, from Senator Strom Thurmond to David Halberstam and others. And that symposium, we want to underline, was organized by students and brought to the campus in '68. But a lot of other things were happening in this period, and we want to talk a little bit about the larger context of the 1960s and the sort of changes that were, or the changes that were going on. The Black Student Action Association was formed at Miami in 1968, and their intention was to pressure with the administration to improve the standing of Black students and Black faculty at the campus. National events were becoming more polarized. The national political resistance was coming here through this film festival. This is a flyer from the Miami Archives. There's a lot of stuff there that's left from these days. Somebody printed this up and duplicated it and handed it out. Notice the titles of the films: Pig Power, Chicago Convention, Resistance, People's Park in Berkeley. And also notice that this was sponsored by the Miami Western Student Mobilization Committee. Western was a site of a great deal of campus activism in this period, and many of those students were in coalition with some of the students at Miami. The women's movement was expressed very clearly in the 70s. Associated Women students brought Kate Millett, one of the people who was a strong contender for a lead voice in what was happening with women in society. She wrote a book called Sexual Politics, and she came here to speak along with Sheila Tobias. And here we have a good representation of what was called the counterculture of this period. Program board and the Associated Women students brought Timothy Leary. And if you don't remember Timothy Leary, he was a Harvard professor who claimed that one could alter their state of consciousness through the use of LSD. In the lower left, you'll see an excerpt from the student article. Leary will speak at Withrow Court. At this time, he was an ex-Harvard professor advocating LSD. A substance, he said, was the spiritual equivalent of the hydrogen bomb. So we were supposedly expanding consciousness. Music. A number of you sent questions about what kinds of music were played, and we're only going to use one example here. Simon and Garfunkel played to a crowd of 11,000 in Millett, the largest group that had ever gone to Millett for a performance. And there were many other musical groups who came to campus, and they reflected the changing tone of anti-war sentiment in that period. Now, here's something to think about. Helen Horowitz said many different student subcultures came together in the 1960s in common cause. And first thing we want to say about fraternity life is there is some indication in the documents that are left behind that they were adopting a sort of countercultural style. Now, we could discuss whether or not that's always been the case with social fraternities or not. But if you can recall those images in yearbooks of dapper young men with coats and ties, this was the yearbook picture in the Recencio for Delta Kappa Epsilon. But I want you to pay a particular attention to the names they put in the Recencio: A WAP, T Spacer, Baby Cakes, Vulture, Meth, T-Head, A Sloth. So something was changing. And then there were symbolic actions. These are kind of comic, maybe in a black humor way. This picture appeared in the Miami Student of Marty Donsky, who later became one of my students and made a film in this period, which he's donated to our archives. But in this story, Marty Donsky is pictured, and note what it says here. No one in the administration took Marty Donsky seriously when he challenged Vice President Robert Etheridge to a joust. The weather was fine, said Donsky, but only a few supporters showed up. His future plans uncertain, the challenger promised a statement. If you only look at the image, I ask you to contemplate what you think that is. If you look below, you can see it's the People's Mass Violation Organizational Meeting for 24-hour visitation tonight at East End at 7 p.m. So this flyer was trying to agitate around the question of male-female visitation in the residence halls. That theme appeared prominently in the student newspaper and student publications throughout this time because Miami's in loco parentis rules did not allow the kind of freedom that students wanted to see. Well, some of the faculty, one might say the younger faculty, but I don't know that they were all truly young. But this group of people who boldly signed their names to a small document called the Gentle Revolution described themselves as the new university conference, and they issued a call for what they called radical reform at Miami University, together with some proposals. If you scan down to the table of contents of their booklet of demands, it's really interesting to see what they chose as radical revolution. They wanted to have seminars for the first year students. They wanted to have special studies programs. They wanted to have joint interdisciplinary seminars in the junior year. My favorite is request number 5, a decent university bookstore. Many of these things would be implemented later, but the ones at the bottom, that Miami University and the ROTC should no longer have a relationship, and that teachers should not have to disclose information about students who were subject to the draft. Those things precipitated a reaction from, here I call them more established faculty, and maybe I'm following the term of the day, but at any rate, quite a number of people, as you can see on the right, signed a petition called "The University in a Time of Crisis, a Declaration of the Voices of Reason. We're for peaceful evolution and against militant revolution, reasonable discussion, not chaotic confrontation. We are for a university dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth and against one dominated by partisan political activity." Of course, the underlying theme under all of this disputatious environment was the Vietnam anti-war protest. Here you can see a cartoon that appeared in the Miami Student. Dr. Shriver is handing a student his diploma, and on it it says draft notice or death certificate. In 1969, students rallied to support the national moratorium against the war. They wanted the cancellation of classes. 2,000 people marched on Lewis Place. Dr. Shriver was not home. There were fraternity allies in this. Betas supported going to the March on Washington and signed their names in an advertisement that appeared in the Miami Student. A moratorium teach-in happened on the Miami campus on October 16th, 1969, and here you can see an image of people grouped in front of Roudebush Hall. All across the center of campus, faculty met with students in small groups and protested the war through teaching about the moral issues that were associated with that conflict. Here we have perhaps a more comic thing. There was a flower brigade on campus, they call themselves, and they marched by the ROTC drilled on campus, and they marched behind them in a drill for peace with brooms and mops and sticks and whatnots. And while you might think that's amusing, notice what the newspaper said. Observing the proceedings were the Chief of Safety and Security, the Oxford Chief of Police, a lieutenant of the state troopers, the dean of men, the commanding officer of the ROTC, Air Force, and Navy, and the director of public maintenance. So the university was taking these displays rather seriously. slow down just a little bit and allow you to look at these pictures a little more carefully. You can see in the upper right-hand corner an image of the interior of Rowan Hall, which was designed for naval officer training, and it had in its original version in 1947 gun emplacements and a bridge and the like. But what happened was a spontaneous combustion, according to the Miami students. About 300 students occupied the building to protest the presence of ROTC on campus, and that would have been April 15th. And here are some pictures of that. Some of you may identify yourselves here. I don't know. One of my former students was in the building and sent some photos. Bob Leese, and so I've used a number of these. I want you to consider what the character of this situation was in Rowan Hall, because that is a matter of dispute. This gentleman, Ted Soares, who's identified on the left, seated on what some have described as a replica of a mine, was described in the Miami Student newspaper as a former Miami student who came in, and he was described as helping people frame a set of demands for the administration. On the right is one of the pictures, and you'll see some more. How did people get to Rowan Hall? Well, there had been a rally in front of Rowdebush Hall protesting the Vietnam War. And in that rally, a number of passionate speeches were made. And a young man named Dusty Stetler was among the speakers. And he allegedly, at the end of that rally on the 15th in the afternoon, said to the group, we have talked a lot, but we need to do something. And so they went to the ROTC building, Rowan Hall, forced open the door, and went inside, generating the images you have just seen. And Dusty Stetler is pictured here at the bottom. He's the gentleman with the patriotic scarf around his neck and the sunglasses. The fellow sitting on the cannon, he's got a replica Viet Cong flag, which he's planting in a cannon. In the upper right, we have an image of people in the building. They don't look particularly anxious. They're more curious, I suppose, but I've pointed out that among the pictures that Bob Leese took, there was one showing that Daryl Hart, the assistant dean of men, was mingling among the crowd, probably keeping an eye on things. How would you evaluate these pictures? This is early in the protest, which lasted from late afternoon on into the evening. People seem to be sitting around rather casually, and I particularly like the image in the upper right. A naval officer is inside the building, apparently talking with students and sort of leaning casually on the bench. That doesn't mean it was necessarily a festive occasion, although some have claimed there was a rock and roll band in the place and people had pizza. And I don't know for sure because others dispute that. But then something happened. Dr. Robert Etheridge, the Vice President for Student Affairs, showed up, and he began to read a disruptive behavior statement. This picture is also from the Miami archives, and you can see Dr. Etheridge in the lower right corner with a bullhorn and a student holding up a microphone. And incidentally, in the top, in the center, with his hand up, that's Dusty again. Dusty, by the way, would serve some time for this. Here are the disruptive behavior statements. These are in the archives, and I won't take the time to read all the perhaps tedious official language, but we will look at this one. Dr. Etheridge read Statement 1, which warned people that if they didn't leave, they would be preemptorily suspended and subject to arrest. And then he left. He came back a short time later and he read Disruptive Behavior Statement 2. Your refusal to comply with a request made by an official is a flagrant violation of proper conduct and premeditated defiance of university authority. Students are now officially suspended under the conduct regulations and are at this point no longer students at Miami University. All present are advised that if you do not leave the building, you should be arrested for trespassing under the authority of, and so on and so on. Good order on the campus. Then things begin to change. The Ohio Highway Patrol had been called by the head of the campus security, and the first people who came were sort of turned away by a raucous crowd, and they called for more reinforcements. But they then came into Rowan Hall after Dr. Etheridge read Disruptive Behavior Statement 2 and began to arrest people in what seemed like a fairly orderly fashion. You can see students sat down at that point, and they were escorted out of the building to the north side one at a time. There are several images of these arrests that appeared in newspaper accounts. What's happening most likely is that students are taking a passive resistance tactic that they have seen in civil rights demonstrations and other demonstrations. They're just sitting down, and the Highway Patrol is moving them out. This image in particular I find fascinating because you see the lady or the woman at the lower left seems to be smiling, and I'm not sure what image is on the face, what expressions on the face of the gentleman who's being picked up. Not everything was festive. This gentleman got pulled out by the hair. So 176 people are arrested, and they're photographed outside the building. You can see that in the two pictures to the right. They're loaded into buses, vans, and police cars. There's several disruptions of that activity. Someone let the air out of the tires of a van. The bus broke down. Finally, people were taken away in police cars. Meanwhile, a crowd was gathering, and that crowd resisted the situation that was going on, and there's some dispute about what happened in the form of that resistance. Some people say it was quite orderly. Others say they threw pieces of coal from the nearby coal plant, or rocks that they found, or other things. But police responded, and the response was probably led by the Butler County Sheriff's Department, and who had brought tear gas and mace, and one department came with police dogs, because this dispute or confrontation spilled over toward the University Center and then toward Uptown. So it became quite a disruptive, disorganized, conflict-ridden scene, a little bit maybe out of control. You can see the two people here on the left are wiping away the effects of tear gas to students. A police dog supposedly charged into the Fiji House and bit someone, and we have firsthand testimony that that's the case. So those events drew different reactions, and we're going to look at a few of those reactions before we turn to the long-term consequences of this event. So let's start with Governor James Rhodes. Governor Rhodes came to campus the following morning. He was here, and he and Dr. Shriver had a press conference in Rowdebush Hall, and it was reported that he said this is in the Miami Student, when a situation gets completely out of hand, we're here to help. And he had brought a battalion of 700 National Guard troops, soldiers, and positioned them at the Nike missile base, which was just west of town out on Taylor Road and Todd Road. And they set up shop there. And he said, "We've got this problem going on and we're here to help." President Shriver was very active at this point and said, "Let's don't bring them to campus. We can keep this under control." How did the students respond? Well, the student protesters had been planning a general strike of classes for the 20th, but on the 16th, they said, "Nope, we're going to strike now." And this detailed account on the front page of the Miami Student is a very interesting statement of what happened from the point of view of students at the time or immediately after the event. Flyers and handbills began to appear everywhere. Some academic departments produced statements that they wanted to strike normal classes or normal operations. This one I put in because it's an interesting duplicated statement. "The moral injustice of the United States, the state of Ohio, and Miami University must come to a halt. It is our moral duty to stop the university from ordinary business. Especially," they say, "how can we stand idly by and watch our fellow human beings harassed and attacked by dogs, mace, riot gas, and nightsticks?" So here are some pictures of the strike activity. Students made t-shirts and signs. Here are the demands. Now, Black students had come into Rowan Hall and added some long-standing demands for improvement of the situation for Black students and Black faculty on campus to the demands that the Vietnam War protesters had produced. So the printed demands were, "We're going to strike until the university agrees to give no academic credit for ROTC, to get ROTC off campus within a year, that there will be no reprisals against protesters. We will meet the Black student demands for increased student enrollment, graduate assistance, Black professors in all departments, and improvements in the Office of Black Student Affairs and the Equal Opportunity Program." More images of strike activity. The defense fund for the 176 was to raise money to pay the bail for those arrested. These photos are interesting. There's a group on a mass meeting on Roudebush Hall lawn. Over on the right, the Black Student Action Association leaders are speaking, "Unite or perish." To the lower left is supposedly the evidence that Craig Webster, Fiji, was clubbed by police and attacked by dogs. Here's a rally outside Upham Hall toward the Bishop Circle in that courtyard. You can see that many students are sympathetic and turning out. But then something else happened. The Great Oxford Flush-In of April 21st, 1970. What was that, you say? Well, at a designated moment, students turned on faucets, shower heads, flush commodes, and all across campus in a coordinated fashion, and it drained the Oxford water tower. The village officials were not happy. Here's the reported impact on the Oxford village. When taps, showers, toilets were opened in 14 Miami buildings, 2 million gallons of water were drained. 300,000 gallons of water were stored in the Oxford Municipal Swimming Pool for emergency fire protection. Miami was eventually charged about $2,800 for excess water use, but perhaps even more significantly, Oxford residents were angered by water coming up in their basements, and some decried the waste of water on the day before Earth Day. Student Senate President Ron Hall wrote, the Senate passed, and he announced in the Miami Student a formal apology. His disenchantment, his disillusionment, and his distress at this thoughtless and disruptive conduct that can neither be condoned nor tolerated. And we hope that this will be the last act of its type, and so thoughtless and disruptive. So things begin to calm down. Sentiment began to shift away a little bit from the protesters about the Vietnam War and about the situation that had happened in Rowan Hall. Earth Day was celebrated. The architecture department built structures along Slant Walk for the first Earth Day, and we're celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day yesterday. Most of the arrested students were released and their enrollments reinstated. Bob Sides provided this image of his court receipt. Cost him $15. So I'm going to pause here for a moment of questions. I've 60 or more questions, and they're very interesting questions, and I love them. And also many long statements were written by people who were involved at the time or remember it one way or another. But here are a couple of questions that came up over and over again. Hey, where were you, Kurt Ellison, when these events happened? Interesting story. I interviewed at Miami University in the January of 1970 for the job of directing the American Studies program and becoming a professor in the English department. When I interviewed, there were lots of bright students and active young faculty involved in the American Studies program, and I just thought it was a great place, and I accepted the job. I then went back to the University of Minnesota, and I sat in my apartment most of the time when I wasn't teaching and wrote my doctoral dissertation, finished up my doctoral work. And then, in the midst of all that time, all of these events happened at Miami. I arrived back here in July. I arrived back here in August for the opening of the fall semester, and I found that a number of the students that I had met when I interviewed, and a number of the faculty that I had met when I interviewed, were no longer at the university. They had left, and they had been involved in the protest events. And of course, that piqued my curiosity about the nature of this event, and I've been thinking about it and collecting information about it now for almost, 50 years almost. Another question that came up was what sources are available for studying this topic. And here we want to celebrate our archival collections and our documents that are available there. You could find newspapers, yearbooks, contemporary publications from that day, reports that were done in the aftermath, a variety of official documents, photographs, in the Miami University archives, where Jackie Johnson would be happy to help you see some of those, I imagine, or the Smith Library of Regional History in Oxford, which has a collection as well. There is a student film made by Marty Donsky and student photographs, and you've seen some of these here by Bob Leese from 1970. One of our alumna has written a novel based on these events. Her name is Sandra Gervis, and her novel is called The Pipe Dreamers. There are studies by recent students of 1970 events, some of them quite good. And then there are books by Walter Havighurst, which I strongly recommend. The Miami Years chapter on this event. Dr. Shriver doesn't say much about it, but he talks about it a little bit. And then I already mentioned Helen Horowitz. There are also studies of other universities in Ohio that you could consider. Ohio State, Ohio University, Bowling Green, and Kent all had traumatic events of one kind or another. And that takes us to what happened on May 4th, 1970. Now, notice the Miami event has already calmed down. It's in April. But on May 4th, something rather analogous or similar occurred at Kent State when Governor Rhodes called in the National Guard to respond to campus protesters there. And here you can see a few images. All of these images are from Kent. And as you know, if you were there, or from the Crosby, Stills, and Nash tune that played in my radio when I was driving to Miami in August, or word of mouth. 4 people were killed, and that was reported the next day in the Miami Student as a major story. 4 people killed at Kent State. Right away, things began to flame up again. Almost literally. On the right, you see from the Recencio some pictures of small fires that were set on campus. There were stories of Molotov cocktails being thrown. A small building was burned on the outskirts of campus. And there was a huge in memoriam march for Kent State people that went all across the campus. And these were pictured in Recencio. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into everything that Dr. Shriver did in this period of time, but suffice it to say, he walked the campus day and night and the town day and night and talked to students trying to bring calm. That story is told very vividly in Dr. Havaker's account in chapter 27 of the Miami Years, and I encourage you to read it. Finally, on May 7th, he, with perhaps some influence from Governor Rhodes and state authorities, decided that the possibility of violence and the prospect that he could not control the situation required that the university be closed. And so this statement of closure, which is still in the archives, was issued by Dr. Shriver very reluctantly, but he did close the university, and it was closed for 10 days. But then not everyone left town. Most people did, but not everyone. Student leaders stayed on campus and talked with Dr. Shriver and other university officials and began to negotiate for some changes at the time of reopening. And so when the campus reopened, you'll see the student reports, hey, trustees passed freshman visitation. Remember the 24-hour visitation thing? Suddenly, the student senate adds 18 students and the university council adds 12. Grading policies are relaxed. The deadline for grading is relaxed, and a new no credit plan is offered. So there's a very immediate response to ease up on some of the discipline that had preceded this event. Another reaction, Mr. Dollaboy, the vice president for alumni affairs, reported that initially alumni gifts fell 50%. However, that would recover. And then there were disaffected students. Here's a group of students who sent letters to the campus newspaper, and some of them are particularly interesting. To the editor, these former inmates have interrupted our zonked wanderings around Woodstock Nation to send the following letters to the office of the registrar. One gentleman says, in case, this is to inform you in case you haven't figured it out, or in case you care, I'm not returning to Miami this quarter. And then I like this next one. Gentlemen, I quit. Sincerely, Joseph Ozer. The only way to liberalize what Pig Nation calls universities is to destroy them. The only true universities are in Woodstock Nation. So some people left and joined the larger counterculture movement, and that was true of students, and it was true of some faculty. But not everyone did. A lot of people stayed, and a lot of people stayed on campus. The holiday crowds at the state park during what would have been the spring break were described by the Oxford Press as wall-to-wall epidermis and suntan oil. The gentleman in the upper right sent this picture. He was back in town and seated on the curb uptown. And the comment there is, hey, this is not all bad, and the merchants are glad to have the students back. So we're going to say a few things about the birth of the Public Ivy, which I believe is this is interpretation, of course, but I believe all of these events were a tipping point in the history of the university, as there had been previous tipping points in earlier days, that moved the university in a different direction. And we're going to summarize that a little bit and then take a few questions that have come in during the webinar. Well, here are the vice presidents in the wake of 1970: John Dolliboy, Robert Etheridge, Lloyd Goggin, and David G. Brown. I love this picture. I think I knew all of these people and still know the one on the far right. And I think this picture captures some of their spirit. But what I want to point out to you is these three vice presidents on the left are all World War II generation. And Dr. Brown is not. He's 34 years old when he becomes the provost of Miami in July of 1970. And I like it that he's just seated on the ground and being casual, or I'm seated on the floor and being somewhat casual in this situation. The Institute for Environmental Science had been founded in 1969, and when the Nike base was decommissioned in 1970, the university acquired it, and eventually, in the next few years, they moved in there and started having classes, so the Nike base became an environmental science center. They were later headquartered in Boyd Hall. And then Western College becomes a part of Miami in 1973. David Brown and Philip Shriver were the Miami leaders in that event. It was the largest land acquisition to Miami in its history. But it's interesting, I think, that the Western College had financial problems they couldn't solve. Miami paid off their debt of $3 million and acquired the property. It was called an affiliation and merger, and there was an intent right away to create a program that carried on some of the character of the Freedom with Responsibility program that Western had, which was emphasized more independent study, and to blend it with Miami. This is from the report of the Miami planning team, which I think tells you something about the direction education is going to go. The aim of the university is education in mind and character, liberating the entire person, which encourage respect for and awareness of one's feelings and the capacity for spontaneity, affection, sentiment, and personal commitments, all in addition to the content of what one studies. So now we're beginning to look at the entire human development of students. And that was carried out in an important grant from the Lilly Foundation to create a program to study what are the best practices in college teaching. It's still going strong. It's now had a worldwide impact and publishes a journal. But that was an important point in initiating the kind of teaching that occurs at Miami today, holistic. By the 1980s, we were reforming liberal education, which was described in the student newspaper as another revolutionary change, by the way. It established a set of liberal education principles, thinking critically. This is what every liberal education course ought to do, or some would call it the general education program. What it ought to do for every single student at Miami: teach them or help them to learn to think critically, understand contexts, engage with other learners, reflect, and act in addition to their content learning. And then by 1985, Richard Mole was studying public schools that were high quality at a reasonable price. And he published a book called The Public Ivies in 1985. And you can see from this little cover, it's in the upper left, that Miami was among them. And the clips at the bottom are from the current Miami website. What is a public Ivy? They say. And they also point out the many high rankings that the university receives for best value in undergraduate teaching among public universities and other features. A public university that provides an exceptional return on your educational investment, has a rich history and tradition, and has a picture perfect campus. And that's only part of the story. And indeed, I want to share with you that it's been a great pleasure to show you some other parts of the story of how we became a public Ivy. I want to thank J.J. Slager and Michelle Rosecrans of the Alumni Association for helping make this webinar possible. Bob Schmidt, former director of the archives, and Valerie Elliott, the manager of the Smith History Library, assisted when I first started working on this PowerPoint a number of years ago. And we have images from the Miami archives, from the Smith Library of Regional History, from Robert Lease and Robert Sides in this presentation. And we want to thank you all for that. So now, I believe we have some time for questions that have come in during the webinar. I want to remind you that you can contact me by email if you wish. And this presentation will be on YouTube, so you can go back and look at some of these images more carefully. Thank you.
Yes, this is Michelle Rosecrans with the Miami University. Dr. Ellison, hopefully we'll be back up for just a minute here.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
All right. Let's see if we can have someone else jump in here with the questions. Trying to get that fixed. Kurt, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Well, so yes, one of the questions was, did Kent State go on strike in support of the strike at Miami? So I don't know if perhaps you could speak to that.
Yes, not to my knowledge. They probably, well, the various state universities were quite aware of what was going on around the state, but I don't know, and it's not clear that any of the events at Kent State were a direct response to what was happening at Miami. So I think of it more as parallel protests. And indeed, this was happening all across the United States. And virtually every major school had some sort of expression like this. And Miami's just a little bit earlier than Kent. And the Kent event, which came a little later, is the one that gave Miami some notoriety.
Okay, great.
Can I comment a little bit? May I say something about Bob Meredith?
Yes.
The comment that came in. Bob Meredith.
Kurt, could I read that comment again? Because I understand that the audio was cutting out at that point.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll read that again. Sue Ann shared with us that she says, I was Bob Meredith's student in my minor in American Studies. and he changed my life, turning a naive conservative girl into a knowledgeable progressive woman. I still have the final paper I wrote in my senior year for his class, which of course was canceled early after Kent State. And Sue Ann says that yes, she was arrested at Rowan and spent the night in jail. So to turn it back to you to speak to that.
I just want to say something about Bob. Bob Meredith was a graduate of the University of Minnesota program in American Studies, as I was. Later, I never knew him there. He was ahead of me. He had come to Miami and worked with Walter Haverhurst and others to shape the American Studies program in the College of Arts and Science into a really important and vital program. And I'm sure it had great impact on students. Bob was attracted to the moral questions about Vietnam protest, and he wrote about that. He was one of the leaders in the New University Conference. When I was hired at Miami, technically I was to replace him because he was going on leave, just for in the director job and also to be in the English department. Bob never came back. He went to the West Coast, took a job at UC Davis, moved farther into the counterculture, and eventually left academia altogether. But a very important and significant person for these events at Miami. One more anecdote. Outside the American Studies office, there was a bulletin board. When I arrived, Dean Carl Lemper, a fine magisterial dean, told my new dean, told me that I was getting a new bulletin board. And I said, why am I getting a new bulletin board? Well, actually, I said, that's what I said to myself. What I said to him was, what kind of bulletin board? And he said, much smaller. And it turns out that Bob Meredith's bulletin board had been one of those focal points around campus where students coordinated by leaving notes about what they were going to do and what was going on in anti-war protest. So Bob Meredith should be remembered. Other questions?
Yes. So there was another question with a bit of a lead in comment. So I'll read that to you. Craig Anderson, class of 71, submitted, I lived in the Fiji house at this time, a junior. It is not disputed that the police came into the foyer of our house. I was 5 feet in front of the police officer and dog when my brother Craig Webster was clubbed over the head and lay unconscious and bleeding on the floor of our foyer. He says, shortly thereafter, they tear gassed our house. My question, what prompted this officer to enter our house?
Thank you for that question. And I did not mean to leave the impression that this was a disputed matter. We know there were some hospital admissions, there were dogs. There's one report that the dogs are from the Hamilton Police Department, but the Butler County Sheriff probably had them. But the point I want to make here is when the Highway Patrol was called, that triggered a call to a number of other local police agencies. So there were 15 to some reports, 15, some 17 different police or law enforcement agencies on campus, and they didn't have good communication. And they didn't know, many of them, very much about interacting with students, and certainly probably not sympathetic to student protest. Students were congregating uptown and congregating in the streets. And I think some of these deputy sheriffs and their dogs were agitated. They thought I don't know what they feared, but they feared something. And yes, it is true. A dog charged into the Fiji house, and Craig Webster was bitten.
There was another question that has come in. What became of the Nike base? What is it now? A great session. That was from Bill Schilling.
Okay. The Nike base, the site is still there. It's a remediation site for contamination at the present time. Miami still owns the property, I believe. It had been used in the immediate aftermath of Miami acquiring it. One of the buildings was used for classroom space for the Institute for Environmental Science, which I always thought was a nice irony. There may have been some storage there as well. Today, it looks rather dilapidated and abandoned, with the one exception that the public radio station transmission tower has been built on that site, and I understand that it will probably replace the one that has been at Williams Hall, but there's a nice big radio tower there as well.
I did want to share one more comment that came in from Dave Lukey. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. He said President Shriver saved the day after the Rowan Hall incident with his circulating daily and nightly throughout campus, talking and listening to the students, other faculty, and administration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to think about, and I hope you will read the account in Haverhurst's book about what Shriver did in those days. I can tell you that when I arrived in 1970, the very first faculty meeting in Hall Auditorium was packed. Everybody came. When Dr. Shriver walked in the room, he received a prolonged standing ovation. And I believe that people credited him with having a way of making contact with students and keeping calm when otherwise things could have gone really south in the direction of violence. Very early on, I didn't mention it here, but he had gone to a protest in the Miami libraries, similar to the sit-in later in Rowan Hall. And this story was told by Mr. Dollarboy, who was not particularly sympathetic to these kinds of activities. But he said he heard that students were occupying the library and they were protesting for longer library hours. So he hastened over to the scene to see what could be done to get these students out of the library. And when he walked in, Dr. Shriver was sitting on the floor with the students talking to them, and they talked it through. And indeed, they extended the library hours, and things melted away peacefully. There is some debate about whether or not Dr. Shriver could have defused the situation in Rowan Hall had he come there. And some say he could have and should have. Others say the communication was not clear, and yet others say, well, there was an installation involved that included the military. What we do know is the generational conflict played out in the way we've described here today, but in later days and in earlier days, as he had done in earlier days, Dr. Shriver tried to keep calm, and we think that especially means that the National Guard never came to campus and never got the itchy fingers that they got apparently at Kent State. And so at Miami, while there was disorder, disruption, and police dogs and mace and tear gas, and there were never any people killed. And we can be grateful for that.
Indeed. Well, I would like to say thank you to everyone for joining us today for this wonderfully informative webinar. We're grateful to Dr. Kurt Ellison for sharing his expertise and knowledge. What a treasure we have in your research and your passion for documenting Miami history. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and we hope that you'll take a look at our upcoming webinars and join us again for another one soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.